Blood in the Snow, the Donner Party DNA Truth. Archaeologists found, when they excavated the campsite at Alder Creek in the Sierra Nevada mountains, beginning in 2003, thousands of bone fragments from the winter of 1846 to 1847, and DNA analysis of those fragments fundamentally changed what science could say about the most famous survival story in American history. But the science begins with the dream that put those people on the mountain in the first place. The year is 1846. The United States government has just declared war on Mexico and is in the process of claiming California. The idea known as manifest destiny, the belief that American expansion to the Pacific was not just a political goal, but a divine inevitability, was at its most intoxicating. Newspapers described California as a paradise of mild climate and rich soil, a place where ordinary families could reinvent themselves as prosperous landowners. George Donner was 62 years old and prosperous already, a successful farmer from Springfield, Illinois, with a large family, a respected name, and enough money to outfit the journey in considerable comfort. His brother Jacob was similarly established. James Reed, who would travel with them, was a businessman with a large household and a custom-built wagon that contained a stove, a second story, and a spring-cushioned floor, the most elaborate vehicle on the trail that year. When the Donner and Reed families left Independence, Missouri in May 1846, they joined a larger wagon train of several hundred people. They carried months of provisions. They had maps. They had guides. They had read the books. What they did not have, as events would demonstrate, was the specific knowledge that the most experienced men on the frontier would have given them for free if they had been willing to listen. Navigation records found in the journals and letters of the 1846 emigrant parties document the decision that transformed a difficult but manageable overland journey into a catastrophe. A choice made in the belief that a faster route existed, based on a guidebook written by a man who had not fully traveled the route he was recommending. Lansford Hastings was a lawyer and promoter who had published a guide to emigrant trails in 1845. In it, he described a shortcut south of the established trail, bypassing Fort Hall and cutting directly across the Salt Lake Desert toward California. He claimed it saved 300 miles. He had traveled part of it on horseback. He had not taken wagons across it, and he had not consulted the experienced mountain men who knew the terrain in winter. The Donner Party left the main trail at Fort Bridger in late July 1846, following what became known as the Hastings Cutoff. They were warned by experienced mountain men at the fort that the route was unsuitable for wagons and that the season was already late. They went anyway. The cutoff cost them a month they could not afford. The Salt Lake Desert crossing nearly destroyed them. Wagons sank into salt flats. Oxen died of thirst. Water barrels ran dry. The group that finally emerged from the desert onto the Humboldt River in Nevada was exhausted, short of livestock, and dangerously behind schedule. Internal tensions, already building from weeks of crisis, broke into violence in early October when James Reed stabbed and killed a man named John Snyder during an argument over a wagon stuck in mud. Reed was tried on the spot, convicted, and banished from the party, sent ahead on horseback, alone, without supplies, with an instruction not to return. He would survive. His family was still in the wagons. Weather records, reconstructed from tree ring data and contemporary accounts, document that the winter of 1846 to 1847 in the Sierra Nevada was one of the most severe of the 19th century, and that the Donner Party arrived at the mountain pass that now bears their name approximately 1 week too late to cross before the first major snowfall sealed it. They reached Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake, at the base of the Sierra Nevada in late October 1846. The pass above them rose to nearly 7,000 feet. An advance group made one attempt on the summit and was turned back by snow that was already waist-deep in places. The party made camp at the lakeshore, believing the storm would clear within days, and they would cross before the real winter set in. The storm did not clear. It deepened. By mid-November, snow had accumulated to depths that made further movement impossible. The group was fragmented across two main camps several miles apart. One at the lake, where most families sheltered in hastily built cabins, and one at Alder Creek, where George and Jacob Donner's families had set up tents and lean-tos beneath the pines. George Donner had injured his hand on the trail. The wound was infected and worsening. The shelters were inadequate. The food supplies, already depleted by the long detour, ran out within weeks. The party began slaughtering their remaining cattle and horses, then their dogs. They boiled ox hides to extract whatever nutrition the gelatin contained. They stripped bark from trees. Patrick Breen, an Irish immigrant who kept a diary through the entire ordeal, recorded the temperature, the snow depth, and the deaths with a precision that makes his journal the most important first-hand document of the disaster. Survivor accounts found in the testimonies collected after the rescue describe the departure of what became known as the Forlorn Hope, the group of 15 people who set out on December 16, 1846, to cross the mountains on foot and bring back rescue, as an act of desperation by people who had calculated that staying was certain death. The group included 8 men, 5 women, and 2 Miwok guides named Luis and Salvador, who had been sent from California by John Sutter to assist the stranded emigrants. They carried 6 days of provisions, improvised snowshoes made from oxbows and rawhide strips, and no realistic expectation of what lay ahead. The snow in the mountains was measured in feet, not inches. The temperature at night dropped far below freezing. They had no shelter beyond what they could construct each evening from pine boughs. The crossing took 32 days instead of the expected 6. Storms struck repeatedly. The provisions ran out on the 4th day. Men began dying first, a pattern that would hold throughout the ordeal, and that later researchers attributed to biological differences in how male and female bodies metabolize stored fat under extreme starvation. By the time the survivors were losing people faster than they could continue, the question of how to keep the living alive became the central moral crisis of the entire Donner story. The decisions made by the Forlorn Hope in those weeks are documented in survivor testimony and are not disputed in their basic facts. 7 of the 15 reached the first California settlement on January 17, 1847. They had been on the mountain for 32 days. They brought the news that 81 people were still stranded above the pass, alive when last seen, in conditions deteriorating every day. Personal documents found in the California State Library and in family archives held by the descendants of Donner Party survivors include diaries, letters, and late-life interviews that preserve the interior experience of that winter in ways that the bare historical record cannot convey. Patrick Breen's diary is the closest thing to a real-time record of the winter. Breen was a practical Irish farmer whose entries track weather obsessively. Snow depths, temperature, wind, alongside deaths, food supplies, and prayers. The diary was recovered with him when rescuers arrived in February 1847 and is now held at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the most significant primary documents in the history of westward migration. Tamsin Donner was one of the most educated members of the party, a former schoolteacher who had brought botanical specimens, watercolor paints, and writing materials on the journey. She kept notes throughout. She organized her children's lessons, even as the food ran out and the temperature dropped. She sent her 5 daughters out with one of the relief parties in February 1847, watching them leave while she remained behind. She had multiple opportunities to leave with the rescuers and refused every one of them, staying at Alder Creek with her husband George, whose infected hand had spread to his arm and then to his torso. She was last seen alive by rescuers in late February 1847.
Her body was never recovered. She was 44 years old. The children of the Donner Party, many of them under 10, survived in proportions that defied the overall mortality rate of roughly 40%. Several lived into the 20th century. Most gave few public accounts of what they had seen. The silence was itself a form of testimony. Researchers found, when they conducted systematic archaeological excavations at the Alder Creek site between 2003 and 2017, physical evidence that directly addressed the most enduring and most contested aspect of the Donner Party story. And the DNA analysis of that evidence produced results that challenged more than a century of historical assumption. The excavation, led by archaeologist Julie Shablitsky and her team, recovered more than 16,000 bone fragments from the area surrounding the Donner family campsite.
The fragments had been through fire. Many were burned, cut, and split in ways consistent with food preparation. The question the researchers needed to answer was whose bones they were. Mitochondrial DNA analysis was applied to fragments that could not be identified by visual inspection alone. The results were striking. Of the fragments that yielded usable DNA, every identifiable sample came from animal species: cattle, horse, dog, and deer. No human mitochondrial DNA was detected in the cooking fire debris at Alder Creek. The researchers stated their findings plainly. The bones in the fire pit were not human. The cut marks and burning patterns on the animal bones were consistent with intensive processing, marrow extraction, rendering of fat, use of every available caloric resource from the carcasses. The people at Alder Creek were not wasting anything, but the DNA evidence did not support the specific claim, repeated in popular accounts for over a century, that human remains had been processed for food at that location. The findings do not address what happened in other camps or during the Forlorn Hope's crossing. They address Alder Creek specifically. And at Alder Creek, the forensic DNA record said, animals, not people. Court records found in the archives of Sacramento County document a lawsuit filed in 1847 by Louis Keysburg against 4 members of the Fourth Relief Party, a case that provides the clearest surviving legal record of the accusations that followed Keysburg for the rest of his life, and that have made him the most controversial figure in the entire Donner story. Keysburg was a German immigrant who had traveled with the party from the beginning. He was disliked by some of his companions before the disaster, described as quick-tempered and difficult. When the final relief party reached the lake camp in April 1847, they found Keysburg alone, the last survivor, in circumstances that the rescuers described in terms that immediately generated accusations of the worst kind. Keysburg sued for $4,000 in damages and won a judgment of $1, a verdict that cleared him of criminal liability while doing nothing to restore his reputation. He maintained for the rest of his life that everything he had done was necessary for survival, in conditions that no one who had not experienced them could judge. He lived until 1895, working various jobs in Sacramento, the subject of persistent public hostility and occasional newspaper revivals of the original accusations. The application of DNA analysis to this aspect of the Donner story is indirect. No physical evidence specifically linked to Keysburg has been subject to forensic genetic testing. What the broader DNA forensic work on the Donner camps has established is that the evidentiary basis for many of the specific accusations circulating in 1847 was thin, based on the accounts of people who arrived weeks or months after the fact, in conditions of their own distress, interpreting scenes that had multiple possible explanations. Biological research published in peer-reviewed journals in the 2000s and 2020s used the Donner Party's documented survival statistics as a dataset for examining questions about the physiological and possibly genetic basis of survival under extreme cold and starvation. And the results connected the 1846 disaster to broader questions about how human biology responds to crisis. The survival rate disparity between men and women in the Donner Party is one of the most consistently documented patterns in the historical record. Of the 87 people who became trapped above the pass, approximately 40 died. The male mortality rate was significantly higher than the female mortality rate across most age groups. Children under 5 and elderly adults of both sexes had the worst outcomes overall. Researchers have proposed several biological mechanisms to explain the female survival advantage. Women generally carry a higher percentage of body fat, providing a larger caloric reserve during starvation. Female metabolic rate under cold and caloric restriction may decrease more efficiently. Evidence from other historical famines, the Dutch hunger winter, the siege of Leningrad, supports the finding that female physiology tolerates prolonged, severe caloric deficit with lower mortality than male physiology. The epigenetics dimension, whether the stress experienced by survivors left heritable marks on their descendants' gene expression, has been examined in other extreme famines. The Dutch hunger winter studies found measurable epigenetic differences in children of women pregnant during the famine. Whether analogous effects exist in Donner Party descendants has not been formally studied, but the biological framework for such inheritance is established. Archaeological survey records filed with the California State Office of Historic Preservation document an ongoing program of investigation at Donner-related sites that has continued to produce new findings decades after the initial excavations. Findings that have used 21st century technology to see what earlier researchers could not. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is an airborne laser scanning technology that produces precise three-dimensional maps of terrain beneath vegetation, revealing features invisible from the ground. LiDAR surveys of the Donner Lake area have identified structural remains consistent with additional camp structures not previously located by ground survey, and have confirmed at least one feature at Alder Creek matching the footprint of a documented shelter. Personal objects recovered from the excavations include buttons, coins, tools, and fragments of ceramics, the material residue of the domestic lives that the emigrants had been attempting to transplant from the Midwest to California. A collection of objects from the Murphy cabin site at Donner Lake, excavated in the 1980s, included items that helped researchers identify specific families' locations within the camp. The role of the Washoe people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Lake Tahoe and Sierra Nevada region, in the Donner Party story has received increased scholarly attention in recent decades. Washoe oral tradition includes accounts of the stranded emigrants. Washoe individuals brought food to the camps on at least one documented occasion. The Washoe name for the emigrants, recorded by ethnographers, translates approximately as the ones who ate their friends, a characterization that reflects what the Washoe witnessed or heard, and that passed into their oral history as a fact about those particular strangers. Historical assessments found in the scholarly literature on the Donner Party from the past 2 decades reflect a significant shift in how the episode is understood, away from the sensationalized cannibalism narrative that dominated popular accounts for most of the 20th century, and toward a more complete and more accurate picture grounded in physical evidence and biological science. The DNA forensic work at Alder Creek did not eliminate the historical record of what the Forlorn Hope experienced during its 32-day crossing. The survivor testimonies from that ordeal are specific and consistent. What the DNA work did was establish that one of the 2 main campsites showed no forensic evidence of human remains in the cooking debris, and that the historical record had conflated evidence from different locations and different time periods into a single narrative that overstated the uniformity of the group's experience. The Donner Memorial State Park, established at the lake site in 1928, includes a museum and a monumental stone statue whose base is built to the height of the snow recorded during that winter. 22 feet. Standing next to it, the physical reality of what those people faced becomes concrete in a way that no written description fully achieves. What the Donner Party left behind is not primarily a story about the worst of human behavior under pressure. It is a story about the full range of human behavior: the generosity, the endurance, the protection of children, the keeping of records, the refusal to abandon the dying, alongside the impossible choices. The DNA science has given that full range a more honest evidentiary foundation. The people on that mountain deserve the most accurate account the evidence can produce.